community work offered through the Emergency Solutions Grant, Coronavirus Relief Consulting and Staffing Services Contract. I am Kimberly Simpson from ICF, and I will be hosting today's session. Today's training session is part of our new and non-traditional providers workshop series, where we will discuss ESG and ESG-CV homelessness prevention. It is my pleasure to hand the presentation to our first presenter, Gordon Levine.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Gordon Levine. My pronouns are he and him. I am white and Jewish, and I am a lead homeless services specialist with ICF. Would my co-presenter like to introduce himself?
Hello, my name is Michael Thomas. I use he, him pronouns, and I am also a lead homeless services specialist at ICF.
All right, thanks, Mike. Today's presentation is on the subject of homelessness prevention. Let's dive right in. Next slide, please. So our agenda today is 2 hours long, though we're going to make it feel like a lot less than that because the subject matter is exciting. For the first hour, we're going to talk about what ESG homelessness prevention is in general, including its COVID-19 waivers and alternate requirements and best practices for making sure you're running not just a compliant, but a good homelessness prevention program. We're going to take an intermission halfway through, and then we're going to go into our lightning round, which is, an opportunity for y'all to answer questions and test your knowledge about homelessness prevention. Finally, we will save space at the end for question and answer, so you can ask all of your burning questions about ESG homelessness prevention. Next slide, please. Note that while ESG homelessness prevention does flow down through several layers of funders and recipients and subrecipients, today's training is focused on subrecipient homelessness prevention, not street outreach. It is most applicable to HCD's direct subrecipients and to organizations that receive ESG from those subrecipients, sometimes called sub-subrecipients. Next slide, please. Finally, some key vocabulary. ESG stands for the Emergency Solutions Grant Program, and ESG-CV is ESG funded through the CARES Act. HP stands for Homelessness Prevention Projects funded through either ESG or ESG-CV. FY stands for fiscal year, which is the year in which ESG funds are allocated by HUD to HCD. CAHCD is the California Department of Housing and Community Development, which is the largest ESG recipient in the state of California. HUD is the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development and the funder of ESG. A recipient is an entity that receives ESG directly from HUD, like HCD. A subrecipient is a local government entity or nonprofit that receives ESG from a recipient, sometimes called grantees. And UGLUG, which is our favorite acronym, stands for a unit of generalized or general local government. It means your local government or one of its departments. Next slide, please. This is a rough representation of how different layers of regulation and policy interact around ESG. Compliance ultimately means paying attention to and implementing all of these different layers of policy and guidance that incorporates these sort of primary four areas of policy interaction. The ESG, sorry, can we go back? Thank you. The ESG program interim rule is fundamentally the federal guideline related to how ESG needs to be implemented. It says interim, but it's been around for a while, so please understand it to be the rule until a final rule is published. Additional HUD guidance comes out periodically and has come out much more frequently during the COVID-19 pandemic, including guidance related to COVID-19. Those are usually called the notices and waivers. Federal uniform guidance, this generally refers to 2 CFR 200, also called the Omni Circular, and there's a bunch of other names for it, but generally it is guidance related to the financial everything's to do with federal awards, all of which apply to ESG, and that's codified in the ESG interim rule. Finally, your local policies and procedures, and that applies to everything from HCD's written standards that apply to all ESG projects that it funds, down to subrecipient written standards for everything under the subrecipient, down to your own project policies and procedures that apply only to your organization. All of those together, when combined, lead to compliance. Next slide, please. Turning it over now for homelessness prevention basics to Mr. Michael Thomas.
Thank you, Gordon. So yeah, let's jump in and talk about some basics for homelessness prevention. Next slide, please. So what you see here is the definition of homelessness prevention from the ESG program interim rule. And that definition is housing relocation and stabilization services and short and/or medium-term rental assistance necessary to prevent an individual or family from moving into an emergency shelter or another place described in paragraph 1 of the homeless definition, which is basically places not meant for human habitation. So the purpose here and the part to pay attention to is that it is designed to prevent people from moving into literal homelessness. Next slide, please. So in terms of what you can cover with homelessness prevention, the cost of providing financial assistance, and that includes housing costs, case management and other services, including mediation and legal services to help a person or family remain housed. And we're going to talk about those in a little more detail later in the presentation. It's really important to note here that the same costs as rapid rehousing are eligible for prevention. So it's the exact same costs, but those two project types serve completely different populations and they have completely different models of service. I'm going to dwell on that for a second because it's one of the most important things you can take away from this entire presentation. Same costs and same eligible services as rapid rehousing, but completely different models built for completely different populations of people. Also, there's a significant gap between what homelessness prevention can do based on what is eligible and what it should do based on best practices for a well-implemented homelessness prevention program. And we're going to talk about that more later. Next slide, please. And back to you, Gordon.
All right, let's talk about eligible participants. Next slide, please. So eligible participants for homelessness prevention, and this is maybe the most complicated part of the presentation. So we're going to give it all to you, and then we're going to sort of tie a bow on it so it's a little easier to understand. So we've got 3 categories of eligible participants. The first category is category 2 of HUD's homelessness definition found in the Hearth Act, the imminent risk of homelessness definition, which means a person or family who will imminently lose their primary nighttime residence, provided that the nighttime residence will be lost within 14 days of their date of application for assistance, and no subsequent residence has been identified, and they lack the resources or support networks needed to obtain other permanent housing, and their household income is less than or equal to 30% of the area median income. The next category of eligibility is category 4 of the Hearth definition of homelessness, which is fleeing or attempting to flee domestic violence, which is any person or family who is fleeing or attempting to flee DV and has no other residence and lacks the support networks to obtain other permanent housing. The definition of domestic violence also includes, but is not limited to, dating violence, sexual assault, stalking, and human trafficking, and they need to have less than or equal to 30% AMI. Finally, there is an at-risk definition of homelessness that is not part of the Hearth definition of homelessness and is used, to the best of my knowledge, just for ESG homelessness prevention. And it means a person or family who has less than or equal to 30% AMI, and they lack the resources or support networks to prevent them from experiencing homelessness, and they meet at least one of several additional conditions or criteria. Next slide, please. These are our additional conditions for at-risk. I'm not going to read them all out to you. There are a lot of them, and they touch on basically everything that could contribute to homelessness. The one that I want to pull out. The one that I want to pull out and note that there's an error on this slide. The one I want to pull out and note is that the at-risk definition does specify that a person is eligible for homelessness prevention assistance if they have been notified in writing that their right to occupy their current housing or living situation, not that they will experience homelessness, but that their right to occupy their current housing will be terminated within 21 days. It says 24, it's 21 days after the date of their application for assistance. This can be confusing because the category 2 definition, imminently at risk, is 14 days and will experience homelessness. The at-risk definition is 21 days and will lose housing, but might not necessarily experience literal homelessness. The first definition is a best practice. The second definition is not necessarily a best practice, and we will talk about that more in a little while. There's other stuff on this slide. I encourage you to review it. Next slide, please. So who's actually eligible? Here's what it boils down to. People who meet all of the following criteria are eligible for ESG homelessness prevention. Their income is less than or equal to 30% of the AMI, or for ESG-CV and for annual ESG from funding year 2020 and earlier used to prevent, prepare, and respond to COVID-19, which is a pretty small bucket of funding at this point, less than 50% AMI. And they lack another residence or the supports to remain housed or avoid experiencing literal homelessness, and they meet at least one of the following criteria. A, they will experience literal homelessness within 14 days of application. So, but for ESG homelessness prevention, they will experience literal homelessness. Or B, they're attempting or fleeing or attempting to flee DB. Or C, they meet at least one of the additional at-risk criteria on the previous slide. That's who you can serve through homelessness prevention. And if even that seems complicated to you, it's because it is. It's a large definition. We will touch on this more in the best practices session, but we strongly encourage you to internalize the following. In general, for homelessness prevention, you should be serving people who meet the income definition and meet the lack of supports definition. But more importantly, focus in on that group of people who will, but for ESG homelessness prevention assistance, experience literal homelessness very, very soon, which almost always means people who meet the imminent definition. Not always, but almost always. Next slide, please. Takes us back to Mike for eligible activities.
Thank you. So as promised, let's talk about eligible activities. Next slide, please. So in the broadest sense, under the ESG program interim rule, the eligible activities for homelessness prevention are going to fall under two umbrellas. You've got housing relocation and stabilization services, and then short and or medium-term rental assistance. And I'm of course talking about client-facing services here. We're not going into administration and things like that from the interim rule. So housing relocation and stabilization services and rental assistance. Next slide, please. When we drill down into those a little farther, we see under housing relocation, we're talking about things like rental application fees, security deposits, last month's rent, utility deposits and payments, moving costs, and emergency transfer costs associated with an emergency transfer under VAWA. And then the stabilization category includes housing search and placement, housing stability case management, mediation, legal services, and credit repair. Next slide, please. So what you see on this slide is a full list. This full list of eligible activities has complete descriptions and including ESG-CV notice amendments as applicable in the ESG Homelessness Prevention Manual from California HCD. So that manual really consolidates a lot of the regulatory language and guidance for ESG-CV. So that would really be what I would recommend to be your first stop for looking for further details on these. A household can receive up to 24 months of rental assistance in a 36-month period. So that's important to point out. There is a limitation, and it does technically go across all ESG. So through any ESG project, a household should be limited to 24 months of rental assistance in a 36-month period. Excuse me, 36-month period. The full list here. So you can see on the left side, these are things that are eligible under the ESG program interim rules. Some of them have been modified for ESG by the ESG-CV notice, but here you've got rental application fees, security deposits, utility deposits, and utility payments, moving costs, emergency transfer, and lease breaking fees, housing search and placement, housing stability case management, mediation, credit repair, and rental assistance. On the right-hand side, you see things that are eligible specifically for ESG-CV funding and annual ESG as it is used to respond to coronavirus, although it's expiring for the annual funds at the end of this month, I believe. So going forward, these activities will be ESG-CV specific. So you've got training, hazard pay, landlord incentives, volunteer incentives, cell phones and internet, PPE for program participants, furniture and household furnishings, essential services, renters insurance, vaccine incentives, sponsor-based rental assistance, and assisting participants with subleases. There are quite a few details associated with several of these items, so I would recommend that if you have ESG-CV funding and you're looking to use your funding for these items, look at the Homelessness Prevention Manual before you do so, because there are details and limitations around some of those. Next slide, please. So what you see here is a special note on rental assistance requirements. To pay rental assistance on a unit, that unit must meet the fair market rent standards. That has actually been waived for ESG-CV, but in a general sense, you need to be aware that all annual ESG funding, which is going to be funding going forward into the future after CV funding runs out, must meet the fair market rent standard. And all units, regardless of the funding source, must meet rent reasonableness standards. So that's going to apply to every ESG assisted unit, whether it's ESG-CV or annual ESG funding. All units must meet the minimum habitability standards, which are outlined in the program interim rule. They must have a written, signed, legally binding lease. The only time that is not applicable is if the assistance is only for rental arrears. So there's a slightly more lenient requirement there. It does not necessarily have to be a written lease in that case, but any unit assisted otherwise has to have a written, signed, legally binding lease. Next slide, please. And back to you, Gordon.
All right, well, let's talk about the ESG Homelessness Prevention Manual, which is the current name for the document that California HCD is using to define the scope of its ESG HP funded projects. Next slide, please. The goal of the manual, or the policy as I think it will eventually become to be known, is to establish a structure for new and existing HP projects that enables subrecipients and their subs to successfully build projects that are compliant, human-centered, and incorporate best practices from across the country. In other words, create good projects. Another goal is to define the scope of ESG HP projects, including clear information about which ESG-CV waivers and flexibilities are allowable and how they affect new and existing activities. Again, this is about creating projects that are successful. Finally, it's designed to ensure HP projects are efficient and impactful, meaning that they provide tailored assistance to each participant and serve only those who experience literal homelessness without ESG HP assistance. In other words, again, provide, make, design, implement good projects. Next slide, please. So source material for the ESG HP manual, it really flows through these sort of three areas. The first one is the ESG program interim rule, which establishes the foundation for annual ESG, ESG-CV, and is the primary source for the majority of the manual's material. It flows down. The ESG-CV notice CPD 2108 was the sort of most recent foundational document establishing waivers and additional activities to prevent, prepare for, and respond to COVID-19. There was a subsequent waiver put out that adds to rather than amends CPD 2108. But again, those waivers are usually in flux, and we encourage you to visit the relevant site on the HUD Exchange to review them in the event that you are considering engaging with them. Finally, local needs and preferences, and those are local in the sense of being California specific, which includes determining which ESG waivers and activities are appropriate and ensuring that ESG HP is spent impactfully. And that last sentence is guiding a lot of what the thinking around the manual and ESG HP is in general, because the goal again is to design projects that are actually effective at doing the thing they're intended to do. Next slide, please. So the written policies and procedures include all of these sort of general content areas around triage, coordinated entry, participant eligibility, services, staffing, termination and appeals, and general operations. We're going to break those down a little bit here. Next slide, please. So participant triage. The requirement in general is that your policies and procedures at a project level must have a triage process that ensures the project serves only those who will experience literal homelessness without ESG homelessness prevention assistance. The triage process refers to a method for assessing the entire group of project applicants and creating an order in which the project serves them, which may or may not be done in concert with your local coordinated entry system. Probably it is not. Most coordinated entry systems do not have a system set up for ESG homelessness prevention, but if you were lucky enough to do so, you will incorporate it here. Participants have to be ordered in a way that balances the following two factors. Number one, you have to serve those with the greatest need before you serve those with progressively less need. And you have to serve those who are most likely to achieve and remain in permanent housing before you serve those who are less likely to do so. And what that means is you're balancing helping those with the greatest need while also making sure that your money is spent in a way that has a high likelihood of success. Success being people who retain permanent housing after you serve them. Next slide, please. Suite of services. Your policies and procedures, again, this is at a organization project level, have to define each of the following in relation to your services. The services that you can provide, the full suite of services that the project can provide, which can only include those activities listed in the manual. So why are we harping on this? Because ESG HP can provide a lot of services, and there's a strong tendency, less so in HP, but more so in others, but it's still there in HP, to say like, yeah, we do all of this stuff, right? ESG HP can do A through Z, we do A through Z. When in reality, you actually do like A through F. And everything else is like, we might consider doing this maybe if it ever comes up. And so asking you to define your suite of services is a way of getting you to focus in on what your project actually does and say, all right, this other stuff we're going to refer out for. It gets a focused project that knows exactly what it's doing. In addition, you need to have a process for designing an individualized service plan for each participant that takes into consideration both their housing barriers and their self-sufficiencies, which means you got to have a service plan that isn't cookie cutter, that is designed for each individual participant. And as the next bullet tells you, you got to reassess that service plan periodically to ensure that it incorporates current housing barriers. And when you put all of that together, what you're saying is the project has to say what it does. And at the participant level, it has to say, what are the participants' barriers? What are we doing to meet those barriers? And then you have to re-articulate that as you reassess it on and on until the participant is permanently and stably housed. Next slide. Staffing pattern. Your policies and procedures must define each of the following in relation to your staffing pattern. You have to define your estimated caseload for each staff position that provides direct services, which must be sufficient to meet the commitments that you make to HCD. This is our way of saying, if you say you're going to serve 200 people a year, you have to show us how you're going to serve 200 people a year. That's a number out of nowhere. It's not a recommendation. It's just whatever was in my head. But if you say you're going to serve a certain number of people, you have to say, this is how. These are the number of people who will be served by a case manager concurrently in this way. This is important for HP for a sneaky reason. For rapid rehousing, it's important because rapid rehousing is pretty stable. Generally speaking, you can serve about 15 people per case manager in rapid rehousing, and you have a pretty good idea how long people are going to stick around for. For homelessness prevention, it's a lot more about what services you provide and the way in which you intend to provide them. And so concurrency is a more open-ended question, total caseload, and turnover. And so having a way to articulate all of that is important because it is not as obvious or as easy for homelessness prevention as it is for rapid rehousing, which, as Mike mentioned, is just homelessness prevention for a different population. You must also have a process for maintaining data in HMIS, or if you are a DV services provider in an HMIS comparable database, including a process for entering and maintaining participant data in a timely and accurate manner. That process has to include who does that, who on your staff is responsible. It could be the case managers themselves. It could be a person dedicated to it. How often does it happen? When does it happen, etc. And if it's not in your policies and procedures, it likely is not happening in a rhythm that is appropriate. Finally, you can define timely manner in relation to HMIS data as you prefer, but you're strongly encouraged to adopt policies that require data to be entered as soon as possible, like when you get done meeting with the participant right there, but absolutely no more than 5 business days after the data is collected. Next slide. General operations. The policies and procedures must provide sufficient information about the operations of the project that someone who is not familiar with the project, like myself, could reasonably reconstruct it from the policies and procedures, which is intended to accomplish 3 goals. Number 1, in the event of staff turnover, which will occur, there is always staff turnover for whatever reason. It's just a reality of the universe in which we live. New staff should be able to read the project policies and procedures and continue project operations without relying on previous staff for critical information. No one likes to be called from their previous job 3 weeks after quitting by the new person saying, oh God, how do I run this program? We're trying to avoid that. Number 2, external stakeholders, including project monitors, should be able to understand broadly how the project operates without relying on staff reports. This is especially important during the monitoring process. You really want your monitor to be able to sit down with your project policies and procedures and get what you're doing, as opposed to having to call your project director in at 11 a.m. and say, hey, can you explain to me what you're actually doing here? Having it in writing, powerful tool to avoid that. Finally, the policies and procedures should serve as a structure and reference point for the project to ensure that implementation matches intention. In other words, you should be referring to your project policies and procedures to ensure that the folks on the ground, your line staff, your caseworkers, your project managers, are implementing the project with fidelity to the policies and procedures. And if that's not happening, it'll give you a tool to figure out why not and which things should be updated. Next slide. All right, back over to Mike for requirements and best practices.
Thanks, Gordon. So we're going to go through some additional requirements, but then perhaps more excitingly, we're going to talk about best practices. So, you've heard us mention a couple of times that there are things that homelessness prevention can do and things that it should do. So we're going to touch on some of those practices that get you towards that should do portion of that. Next slide, please. So the first one is a requirement. Coordinated entry participation. Homelessness prevention is required to participate with coordinated entry, but most coordinated entry systems either don't mention it or have not substantially built prevention in at this point. So how should a project use coordinated entry? So as I mentioned, most coordinated entry systems don't have provisions for homelessness prevention, and a lot of them also have developed those, but they simply state that each homelessness prevention project defines its own intake and referral criteria. So basically absolving it of the broader coordinated entry system. That creates a situation where prevention, most ESG homelessness prevention has a coordinated entry requirement that they can't possibly meet. So then what should the project do in that difficult situation? At the highest level, prevention projects should work with the continuum of care to determine at the system level, and that's an important thing to remember when we talk about coordinated entry here, it's a system level conversation. So at the system level, how do homelessness prevention projects fit in? Should coordinated entry access points be referring qualified participants to those projects? Should the prevention projects receive referrals only from that source or from other methods? Should there be a uniform intake and prioritization system for prevention? Or should each project handle that individually? So those are all just things to consider, and they're conversations that have to happen with the continuum of care. But that's kind of how that integration begins. In the meantime, if the coordinated entry system doesn't mention prevention, you don't have to meet any requirements specifically because it hasn't been outlined for your local system. But you should still reach out to the likely referral sources. So that's things like shelters or 211 or any other entities that coordinated entry might be working with. Reach out to them to make sure that they know about your eligibility criteria and how to make referrals to you so that you can receive them. Do not take participants from or enter participants into the housing prioritization list. And that's a really important one because that list is typically set up to address literal homelessness and people fleeing DV. And so, homelessness prevention is typically going to be handled differently from that list. So that is not the place to get referrals from immediately. Have those conversations with your continuum of care to determine the best process. Next slide, please. Serve the right people. This is a best practice. The list of eligible participants is different than the list of optimal participants. And projects must work hard to serve only those who will experience homelessness, but for the ESG homelessness prevention assistance. And I'm going to dwell on this one for a second. I really like that but for terminology. That's something I first heard associated with the Supportive Services for Veterans, Veteran Families program and their prevention funding. But that is really the goal. You really only want to be providing this assistance to households that will become literally homeless if they don't receive this assistance. And that's very different from an eviction prevention program. So those are two different models you see out there. This funding is designed to be homelessness prevention, and the optimal participants are the ones who will be literally homeless if they don't receive this assistance. Eviction prevention, on the other hand, is just designed to do exactly what it says. It prevents evictions and doesn't look at what's going to happen should that eviction take place. It's easy to think that if someone's going to be evicted, that they need this assistance, and that's not necessarily true, because being evicted does not by definition lead to homelessness, and it won't for every household. And it's important to remember that this but-for standard is really designed to address situations in which prevention funding is very limited. There's more money out there in the field for prevention at the moment because of ESG-CV, but in normal times, prevention funding is not very abundant. Communities typically don't put a ton of it towards that through ESG, and it is very difficult to get prevention funding through the COC program. So there's just not a lot of it out there. And so that's kind of the rationale behind it. But the basic point of this best practice is make sure that you're serving people with this funding who will become literally homeless to the best of your judgment if they don't receive this assistance. Next slide, please. So another best practice here, housing problem solving. I'm going to invite Gordon to jump in if he would like to on this one at some point, because he is a subject matter expert here. But housing problem solving means using participant strengths and supports to return to or remain in housing. What we're saying here is prevention projects should lean heavily on case management and mediation, because dollar for dollar, it's much more impactful than housing subsidies. So in my opinion, by definition, a homelessness prevention program is engaging in housing problem solving, because you are trying to prevent that person from experiencing homelessness, which is a fundamental part of the housing problem solving process. When that person presents, you're having a strengths-based conversation with them about what their other options might be, and you're not just immediately saying, this person's here, they seem eligible, let's provide some funding. It's going deeper in the case management process to see if they have other options, if they have other resources, and try to get them either into a different housing situation or remain in the one that they are in without experiencing homelessness, and potentially without even using the ESG-CV funding if they have other resources that they can access. Do you want to add anything to that, Gordon?
God, do I. Yeah, so I care strongly about housing problem solving, and so I'm always happy to take a couple of minutes and get on my soapbox about it. Housing problem solving is the best intervention that almost nobody funds. And almost nobody funds housing problem solving because it is counterintuitive, It's relatively new in terms of being a codified set of approaches and techniques. And because it's just like just this close to the just give people what they need and they'll tend to resolve line of things versus the means testing. We've got to be really specific and clear about the way our funds are spent line of thinking on public services. So housing problem solving, which you might know by several other names, sometimes called diversion or rapid exit or rapid resolution or prevention. It's all the same stuff. It's a set of techniques or approaches designed to return someone or maintain them in permanent housing without an ongoing subsidy. So let's talk about what, and then let's talk about why, or rather why and then what. Excuse me. Why would we care to do that? Surely a housing voucher is better for a participant than not a housing voucher. Yeah, probably in many cases. But here's the reality. In almost no community in this country is there enough affordable housing. So even if you had an infinite number of vouchers, there would not be enough housing to support using all of them. And even if there was enough affordable housing, you do not have the vouchers necessary to house everybody. In fact, you don't have anywhere near the number of vouchers necessary to house everybody. The amount of rapid rehousing vouchers is sufficient in a really successful system, a high functioning one, to house like 5% of people who apply for them, right? For homelessness prevention, it's harder to talk about, but the reality is that the need for homelessness prevention assistance far outstrips the availability of homelessness prevention assistance. And that's complicated by the fact that like most of the people who say they need homelessness prevention do not actually need homelessness prevention. They need eviction prevention or they need case management. So the reason that we talk about homelessness prevention is because it's what we got, or housing problem solving is because it's what we have. That is the option, right? In the absence of affordable housing, in the absence of additional money, what we need to do is think smarter and work smarter about the money that we have. And so we engage a mistaken assumption, and we use that mistaken assumption as a way to move forward in delivering services. So this is an assumption that I had, is a mistaken assumption that I had, that I think is reflected widely throughout the homeless services field. And that assumption was this: if you apply for assistance, you have already done absolutely everything that is not applying for assistance. You've hit up your friends for cash, you've asked your parents, you've asked your extended family, you've drawn on all of your savings, you've cleared out your 401k, you've done whatever you possibly can to not experience homelessness. Because, and this I think is a correct assumption, experiencing homelessness is one of the absolute worst things that we can put a human being through. And so a human being who is approaching homelessness will do everything that they can to avoid that situation before coming in and asking for assistance. And there's an error in thinking in that assumption. That error in thinking is that a person who is in trauma or crisis or fear will always act rationally. That's just not true. And so the assumption that when somebody shows up asking for homelessness prevention assistance, that they've exhausted all of their resources, that they've tapped their faith network, that they've got no family member who can help, that they're out of savings, that. Those assumptions turn out not just to be false, but to be like false most of the time. What is true is, in the majority of cases, when people request assistance through homelessness prevention or for shelter or for anything really, people do have resources that they can draw on, but there are barriers to the person drawing on those resources. Sometimes those barriers are emotional. right? Like, I don't want to, so we had a participant situation several years ago where a person was, had presented at an emergency shelter, and that person's sibling had died several years earlier, and it was a wrongful death, and there was a wrongful death suit, and the person had a small amount of money from that set aside, and the person was like, yeah, I need shelter, and I've got money set aside in this account that I promised to myself I would only use in an absolute emergency, and it was more than sufficient to house them. And so instead of instead of saying like, okay, well, you come to a shelter, you're requesting assistance, you need diversion assistance, instead of admitting them to the shelter did the right thing, which was they said, okay, do you have other resources? And they got into it and they found out about this settlement money and said like, okay, so you have this money from your sibling's unfortunate death, surely this is what this was intended for, right? Like, this is the emergency that you had in mind for that. And the person returned to housing. They did not enter shelter. And it's the same thing with homelessness prevention, that people have emotional barriers. I don't want to ask my parents for money because that would hurt my pride, right? I don't want to ask my faith community because it's difficult and I know that they're struggling also. I don't want to ask my something-in-law because there's difficult family relations thing. I don't know how to talk to my landlord about getting an extension. I don't know how to do that, and so I'm choosing to do this thing that I do know how to do instead. And so on and so on and so on. There's all sorts of reasons why people will not access the resources that they have in their own lives. And so housing problem solving, really at the bottom of it, is helping people surface those strengths, those resources, and then, as needed, facilitating them accessing them. So in some cases, like the example that I gave about the person who had that nest egg for an emergency, housing problem solving was helping them realize that this was the time, right? This is the moment for that. But in the example that I gave about like a landlord who's saying, yeah, I'm going to evict you, this is the situation where a homelessness prevention case manager can say like, okay, you don't know how, but I can talk to him. Can I call? What's the number? Can I call your landlord? Can we call your landlord together? Do you mind if I talk on your behalf? We can all talk as a group. And it turns out that those conversations are often very successful. And if they're not successful, it's okay, because they only need to be successful sometimes to be a huge increase in system capacity. And so generally speaking, the way it works is if housing problem solving is successful 1 in 20 times, 5% of the time, it will be as expensive as just giving people subsidies. It's just as expensive. But it is successful more frequently than that. It is an emerging practice. Data is still emerging, but early adopter communities report rates of success well in excess of 50%. It only needs to be successful 5% of the time. It is usually successful more than 50%. And so a homelessness prevention project that is built around this ideology of, first, we ask where they were yesterday. Then we ask where they were last week. Then we ask what their resources are. Then we ask again, and we have these conversations and we push and we dig. And only if those conversations turn up absolutely nothing, which is very rare, do we start looking at things like short-term subsidies. And so, in addition to what Mike just talked about in terms of the but-for principle, right? ESG, homelessness prevention, should only be used when, but for that assistance, the person will experience homelessness. Homelessness prevention subsidies, rental assistance, ongoingly, should really only be deployed once you've exhausted the housing problem solving thing. And it doesn't really need to be, these can be quick conversations. It can be a half an hour, right? It can be 15 minutes. They do not have to be long. Sometimes they're not. Sometimes they are longer. Sometimes they take days. Sometimes it takes multiple conversations. But ultimately, what you're doing is you're building up to more acute, more expensive interventions by starting with the lowest hanging fruit first. And you would be amazed at how much more impactful your program is, because here's the other dirty little secret, and then I will get off my soapbox. I started this off by saying, isn't a housing subsidy just better than not having a housing subsidy? And I was like, yeah, probably. The dirty little secret is, actually, in many cases, no. A housing subsidy is not better than being self-sufficient in the absence of a housing subsidy. And I speak as a person who believes that everybody should have subsidized housing, irrespective of whether they're at risk of homelessness or if they're low income or not. I think everything should be subsidized, right? Like I'm big on social programs. But the reality is that in the society that we live in today, housing subsidies can actually be harmful to people. They can create dependency, they can create resource cliffs, and getting a person into a position where they're self-sufficient without a subsidy is always going to be better than getting a person into a position where they are dependent on a subsidy and then needing to get them undependent on that subsidy or independent of that subsidy. So thank you for letting me on my soapbox there, Mike. I hope that that was valuable to you all. I'm more than happy to take additional questions about housing problem solving at the end or in the chat box.
Yeah, thanks, Gordon. I think it's really important to go through it in detail because I would predict you are going to see the principles of housing problem solving show up in more and more places as we move forward in homeless services. So very important to go through it in detail. Thank you. Next slide, please. Slide. Thank you. So this is a requirement, housing-oriented services. So the goal of homelessness prevention is, of course, to maintain people in housing. And that means resolving the direct causes of housing loss. So what I'm getting at here is something that's not just unique to prevention projects. It happens across a lot of different project types in homeless services, but sometimes there's a strong desire to fix a person who is having a housing crisis or to make them homeless proof. So let's do everything to make sure that they will never experience homelessness again. You know, the funding and the projects through these sources are really designed to address housing. So addressing barriers beyond those that are applicable to attaining and maintaining, or in the case of prevention, to maintaining permanent housing, it's really beyond the scope. And then along those lines too, homelessness proofing. I mean, clearly you want to leave someone you provide services to in a stable position. So we're not saying that you drop people and leave them unstable in their housing. What we're kind of saying here is you can't fix things that are beyond the scope of the homeless services system. And it is often the desire of providers to try and do that through longer subsidies that are needed and things like that. But the reality is there is a large intersection between poverty and homelessness, and the homeless services system is not going to be able to solve poverty. And it's just not going to be possible to completely ensure that every person you serve might never experience a housing crisis again. Again, we want to make sure we leave people stable, but there is a tendency among programs to provide assistance beyond what might be needed to resolve the current housing crisis. And so what we're saying here is just to make sure that services are housing focused, addressing the barriers to housing stability, and then providing resources to the next person who needs them badly as well. So that's what we're saying. Maintain focus on housing and don't try to fix people, essentially. Next slide, please. This is a best practice, progressive engagement. We've talked about this in a few different contexts, but what it really means is delivering gradually escalating services until the person is safe and stable. We do realize here that prevention does have a short timeline usually, but it's still important to think about progressive engagement because it doesn't have to be a short timeline. And like I just said, some projects will go a little farther than they need to with the timeline for a project. So when we think about progressive engagement, what we're saying is first, you reach for case management and mediation to see if you can solve the issue with those. And then if you can't, you can escalate that to providing a one-time payment, and that can be, typically rental assistance. And then if that doesn't create stability, you can move on to an ongoing subsidy. So what we're really doing with progressive engagement here is tying together some of those other concepts we've talked about. So we're tying together what Gordon went through with housing problem solving. And then we're bringing in that idea we talked about earlier of assessing and reassessing what a person's barriers and needs are. And that's kind of what progressive engagement is about. Doing that initial assessment. If they do need some sort of financial assistance from your project, you provide just what they need to maintain stability in their housing. And then you do a reassessment and you kind of go back and determine, do they still need that subsidy? Do they still need that case management? And, it's not about being stingy. You provide people what they need. But what it's about is kind of what I mentioned earlier. Homelessness prevention funding tends to be very limited. And so it's about making sure that that limited funding is being applied in the best way possible. Next slide, please. And finally here, a special note. So we're going to talk about 24-month caps. So for stabilization services, participants are limited to no more than 24 months in a 36-month period. And that's for any combination of services. But what we want to mention here, and this is an advanced concept, but there are several activities that have this 24-month limit. So stabilization has this limit, rental assistance has this limit, utility assistance has this limit. But the limits are specific to each activity and do not need to happen concurrently. So if someone has only received rental assistance from your project, then the clock is ticking on that 24-month limit, right? But if they have not received utility assistance yet, then the limit hasn't, the start of that limit has not kicked in. So it's just important to pay attention that when you think about these limits, they do not have to run concurrently. Another complicating factor is that the cap applies across all ESG, regardless of the project type. So the cap isn't specific to your project as a subrecipient or a sub-subrecipient. It applies essentially to California HCD's ESG program. So the participant should not receive more than 24 months of assistance in a 36-month period across any combination of homelessness prevention and rapid rehousing projects. And we've realized that can be difficult to track. It is an important place to plug why the homeless management information system and being accurate in there is so important. But just be aware that this limit applies across ESG. Next slide, please. That takes us to intermission.
Okay, so we're going to pause for, oh, I'm sorry, you've got the intermission, go for it.
All right, everyone, we're going to pause for a brief intermission and we will resume at 12 o'clock. Okay. Okay, everyone, we're going to get back started and I will hand it back over to Gordon.
All right, thanks very much. Next slide, please. Welcome to the lightning round, where you have the opportunity to test your knowledge of homelessness prevention gained, excuse me, both in the field and over the last hour, with questions that will be popping up on your very own screen. Some ground rules. Each of the questions does have an opportunity to answer not sure in addition to the actual answers themselves. It's always okay to be not sure, especially when it comes to HUD funding sources. Number two, please do try and answer the question in a timely manner. We like to see good participation, and the faster you answer the questions, the closer we can get to a long Q&A at the end of it. Third, we cannot see your individual responses, so please do answer honestly. This is an opportunity for you to test your knowledge, not for us to test how you are learning things. Finally, we do expect to see y'all participating. Again, this is an opportunity for you to test your knowledge. These are questions that will come up when implementing ESG homelessness prevention. And so eyes on the computer screen, and please do be present as we walk you through this stormy sequence. Next slide. Question number one. Aragorn is living in a building that is not suitable for human habitation. He reports that he is fleeing domestic violence. Should ESG homelessness prevention serve him? Is the answer yes, no, or not sure? Poll should be coming up on your screen right now. There you go. As always, a shiny gold star to the first person in the chat box to note what the literary theme of today's questions are. It's always a theme. Literary, some weeks more literary than others, but there's always a theme to the naming conventions of our characters. Absolutely correct to Danielle Arendt, Lord of the Rings, in honor of the new Amazon series that began airing on Friday, the most expensive television show ever produced to date, which frankly, I didn't see it. It was quite, I saw the show, I thought it was quite good, but most expensive ever? I mean, I could think of other things to spend money on. Homelessness prevention, for example. So when we've got a critical mass on the polls, happy to have a look at the results. All right, a whopping 75% of you said yes. So go ahead and click to show us the answer. The answer is no. While anyone fleeing domestic violence can technically be served by ESG homelessness prevention if they meet all of the other eligibility criteria, such as the income limit, a person living in a building not suitable for human habitation is experiencing literal homelessness and should be served by a different resource like ESG-funded rapid rehousing. Bit of a tricky question to start you off with to set the tone for how tricky homelessness prevention is. Next slide, please. Over to you, Mike.
All right, thanks, Gordon. So Bjorn is currently living in an apartment. He just received a signed letter from his landlord saying that the landlord is filing to evict him. Can Bjorn be served by ESG homelessness prevention? Yes, no, or not sure?
Yeah, this question's a bear.
It is. It might be trickier than it seems, even. It is a tough one, but it is also a fairly common situation in people presenting, for homelessness prevention.
Yep. I would go so far as to say this is the most common thing you will see in homelessness prevention. Yeah, Kim, when you feel folks we've hit critical mass, go ahead and close the poll down. Don't have to let us know.
Oh yeah, we have a pretty good split there. 53% saying no, 37% saying yes, and 10% not sure, which again is always an appropriate answer when talking about federal funding sources. But let's take a look and see what the answer is. So those of you who said no, good job. That is probably the rightest answer out of the options you have there. So the answer is probably not. And even if homelessness prevention can handle this situation, it probably shouldn't. So a threat to evict or a notice to pay or quit does not qualify someone as being at imminent risk of homelessness. Bjorn might qualify, under the at-risk and additional criteria, but based on the information provided, the risk of homelessness will likely resolve without ESG homelessness prevention. So what we're kind of getting at there is that whole, serving people who are going to be literally homeless, but for this assistance. That's where the probably shouldn't part comes in. But nice job, everyone who said no. That is the most correct option that we offered you. Nice work. Next slide, please.
We're often looking for the rightiest answer, which is the reality of HUD funding. So question 3, an ESG HP project is providing rental arrears, but no other assistance to Kelleborn. Does the project need to conduct a fair market rent and rent reasonableness assessment on Kelleborn's unit before providing assessment? Yes, no, not sure. I will say this one is straightforward. There's not a righty or a wrongy answer. There's just a right or a wrong answer. All right, let's have a look. Even split between yes and no. Let's have a look. The answer is no. When an ESG homelessness prevention project provides rental arrears, but no other rental assistance, the unit does not need to meet or be assessed against fair market rent, rent reasonableness, or habitability standards. Though I will note, should it later become served with rental arrears, or should it later be served with rental assistance and additional rental arrears, it would at that time then become subject to all of those things. Good job, y'all who got it right. Next slide.
I'm going to take a quick moment to point that out as one of those situations where your logic does not necessarily apply, because rental arrears do fall under the rental assistance line item. And so your intuition would say, yes, you do need to do that assessment. But there is guidance out there from HUD saying otherwise. So good job picking up on that.
Yep, I would go so far as just to remind everyone that when working with federal funding sources in general, but especially with HUD funding sources like ESG, applying logic is never better than going to the interim rule itself, because often your intuition will lead you astray.
Yep, absolutely. All right, number 4. Dwalin will be evicted today and expects to spend tonight in an emergency shelter. Can ESG homelessness prevention use the diversion technique in housing problem solving to assist him? So do you think that housing problem solving would be a good way to assist in this situation? I would venture to say that there is an answer you could always say for, is housing problem solving a good way to assist? I think it's probably the same answer no matter the context, but.
Well, I don't know. I feel like we didn't talk much about it, so.
All right, 72% said yes. Let's put the answer up. Yes, very well done. That is correct. The main distinction between housing problem solving approaches is when they are delivered. So if you're talking about the diversion aspect, that happens on the cusp of experiencing literal homelessness, or otherwise known as the first system contact. For homelessness prevention, the important question is whether the participant has spent at least one night experiencing literal homelessness, at which point they would become ineligible for prevention services because they would be literally homeless, and as we discussed in previous question, would be more appropriate for something like rapid rehousing. Next slide, please.
All right. Question 5, AOWIN is applying for ESG homelessness prevention assistance. The project intends to provide her with short-term rental assistance. Is the project required to use HUD's Part 5 income calculation to determine AOWIN's income and therefore her rent contribution cap? Part 5 income, also known as the income calculation used by your local public housing authority.
I'm going to throw out there while people are answering. I think this is maybe one of my questions. It's kind of a mean question because we did not. It's more designed to see if those of you out there are using Part 5 income calculation for any of your projects. Do you think it applies here as well? Because we didn't talk about Part 5, nor did I in the presentation where I put this question in. So sorry about that.
But Mike, are you? I'll ask this next. All right, so half of you said yes, but a third of you said you weren't sure. That's a good answer. Let's have a look at what the answer is. The answer is no. So Part 5 income calculation and its associated rent minimums and caps were originally created for public housing authorities serving households below 50% of the area median income. People who need ESG funded services generally need more substantial and nuanced assistance than public housing options provide. As a general guideline, ESG funded projects, including ESG homelessness prevention projects, should strongly consider, I urge you to consider, a more flexible payment schedule, such as payments that start at 0% of the rent and gradually increase in tune with participant income. This is designed to take into account both the differences between Section 8 and public housing, which are fundamentally oriented around low-income households and our homelessness assistance, but also to take into account the fact that we do not want to create a resource cliff for those who do receive subsidies. Good question. Next question.
Yeah, maybe you did develop that question, Gordon, and I just stole it at some point for something. But either way, I commend everyone who answered not sure, because that's what I would have put had that question been posed to me when I was on the service provider side of things. Okay, number 6. A participant has been receiving ESG homelessness prevention rental assistance for 20 months. Unfortunately, they are the victim of a sexual assault at their unit. They are approved for an emergency transfer, which will require breaking a lease with 9 months left. Can the project pay the 9 months of rent required by the lease to effect this emergency transfer?
What I was going to say is, Mike, are you a fan of the Great British Bake Off or the Great British Baking Show by any chance?
I have seen limited parts of it.
Fair enough. Well, one of the features of later seasons is the two judges, currently Prue Leith and Paul Hollywood, have got into a habit, no matter what challenge they set during their technical challenges. One of them will say, "Oh, you're cruel. That's a cruel challenge." And the other will say, "It is a bit, isn't it?" Every single time, every challenge. That's a bit cruel, isn't it? Looking at this question, that's a bit cruel, isn't it?
A bit. It's a bit cruel. Ooh, look at the split. 48% say yes and 33% say no, and a solid 19% saying not sure, which again, I always think is a good option here. Yeah, looks like we have a fairly decent split there. So let's see what the answer is. The answer is yes. The project could and almost certainly must continue paying rental assistance, as emergency transfer costs do not count toward the rental assistance 24-month cap. And almost certainly must, because participants cannot have their assistance terminated because they are a victim of domestic violence. So what we're referring to here is emergency transfers affected under VAWA. Because this person was a victim of a sexual assault, then the payments made to affect that transfer, which includes the 9 months of rent, don't count towards the 24-month cap. So yeah, well done, everyone. Next slide, please.
All right, question 7. Faramir is applying for ESG HP assistance. While the ESG HP project is funded using regular ESG, Faramir is at risk of homelessness because he lost his job due to a severe COVID-19 infection. As a result, his household income is 40% of the AMI. Can the ESG HP project serve him? Yes, no, or I don't know. This one's also a bit wicked, to be honest.
Just gonna say that is also a bit cruel.
It is a bit cruel, but it's important and a bit cruel.
It is important.
Yeah, I will say it comes during a week in which new COVID-19 boosters that are targeted at Omicron have been released. I myself am very excited to go get my shot this Friday, and I'm excited to be joined by as many people as possible. All right, answers 60% of you, a solid majority, said no. Let's have a look at how it came out. The answer is no, probably. The AMI cap was only raised to 50% for ESG-CV and for annual ESG from fiscal year 2020 and earlier, when used to respond to COVID-19. While the participant does meet those criteria, it is unlikely that the project still has regular ESG from funding year 2020 or earlier still lying around. Good job, those of you who said no. Next slide, please.
Okay, next question. Gandalf's single-person household is under 30% of the area median income and lacks the resources or support networks to prevent himself from experiencing homelessness. These are elements of the at risk of homelessness definition. Can ESG homelessness prevention serve him? Also a bit cruel. Wow.
It is a little, homelessness prevention is tricky.
It is.
What is ultimately coming out of this, in my opinion.
I actually didn't say it out loud, but that's what I was thinking on the last question. It just highlights that prevention is complex, especially when done well. All right, 85% said yes. Let's see what the answer is. The answer is the project cannot decide based on the information provided. So Gandalf only meets 2 of the 3 criteria under the at-risk definition. The third is that participants must meet at least one of the additional criteria, such as living in the home of another due to economic hardship or one of the others on that list that we provided you earlier. So he meets the AMI criteria, meets the lack of support networks criteria, or I'm sorry, criterion, but does not, well, we don't know if he meets one of the others in that list. So that is why you can't determine based on the information given. So I guess the most correct answer there would have been not sure. Really tricky one. All right, next slide, please.
All right. The local coordinated entry system policies and procedures state that each ESG HP project determines its own intake, triage, and referral processes. Haldier is writing his ESG HP project's policies and procedures. Should his project refer participants to housing via coordinated entry? Yes, no, or not sure? And had I not said anything about questions being cruel before, this is the moment I would pop in and say, this is a little bit mean. It's mean-spirited.
Although we did touch on this during the presentation.
Oh yeah, and we were very clear about it. But still, homelessness prevention and coordinated entry is just a cruel topic all around. Interesting. Half of you said yes, and the rest were divided evenly, no and not sure. Let's see the answer. The answer is no. The coordinated entry system's housing prioritization list, it's no, probably. The housing prioritization list is almost certainly designed to connect participants with resources such as rapid rehousing and PSH, for which ESG homelessness prevention participants are almost never eligible. ESG homelessness prevention projects should not add participants to such a housing list unless that participant later begins to experience literal homelessness. It's a tricky question because there are coordinated entry systems that do have a housing list for people who are at risk of homelessness. Those systems are rare. There's like 5 of them in the country, something like that. So almost certainly the answer is no. But in the event that you have a system that works that way, yes, generally speaking, not even a little bit. Next slide.
Okay, question 9. Oh, I'm sorry, I have a, there we go. Over the past 2 calendar years, oh my, I don't know if I'm going to be able to remember how to pronounce it. Isildur?
Should have watched on Friday.
I know, I should have, and I didn't. The person who I can't pronounce.
Yes, you were.
No, thank you. Has received 24 months of rental assistance through ESG rapid rehousing and has exited rapid rehousing to stable housing 6 months ago, but is now requesting homelessness prevention assistance. Can a homelessness prevention project serve him? So we hit the cap in rapid rehousing and now looking for assistance. Is that possible within this time frame? I have not seen that to know how to pronounce the name yet because I am watching The Mandalorian yet again.
Yeah. How many times is that, Mike?
4.
Yeah, that's about right.
I pick up new things every time.
I can imagine it's very good. This is like the meanest set of questions we've ever set out ever.
Yeah. So we've got 54% saying no, and then the rest of the people kind of divided between yes and not sure. So let's see what the answer is here. Answer is yes. While rental assistance from all ESG projects is capped at 24 months in a 36-month period, there are many services that prevention can provide that are not capped or that have different caps not addressed in this example. So while rental assistance might be exhausted, there are other services that a prevention project could potentially provide here. So that's, an important note, because it's easy to think about it as just a rental assistance program. And if you see that you've exhausted the rental assistance portion, it might be easy to, think you can't serve a person, but there is still potential there. So that's why it's important to figure out exactly what that client needs, and then move forward based on that. Next slide, please.
Okay. That's the same one. All right, to the end. We've reached the end of our presentation and are now moving into the Q&A portion. Kim, if you want to, thank you very much, take that down. We are now in a position, we've actually got quite a lot of time, so we can return some time to y'all if you like, but we are here to answer your questions about ESG homelessness prevention. So do please drop them in the chat or come off mute if you are feeling so inclined, but we would love to hear from you. We're here to help.
And we have been getting unusually few questions.
Homelessness prevention, man.
That sums it up.
Yep. Also happy to answer your questions about Lord of the Rings or The Mandalorian, apparently. You were so inclined. Charmaine in the chat asks, where and how can we access the recording of this wonderful training, as some of us connected late? Great question. Kim, do you want to take that one?
Yes, it'll be sent out to everyone that attended this session, but it's also on the HCD website.
Yep, trainings will be on the HCD website. We also have them on our training website. We have a past website, past website. No, a past website. We have a website that has past trainings listed on it as well. So you can either go to the YouTube channel for California HCD or our website.
Cool. Oh, this is a great question. Teddy asks, are there good case study communities who've done a great job with prevention funding? I gotta tell you, there are communities out there that are doing a good job. I don't know of any good case studies. That doesn't mean they're not out there, but I don't know about them. Mike?
Yeah, I would have to do some research. There's not any I would feel comfortable naming off the top of my head. I do certainly think there are communities out there doing better than others. But yeah, in the public setting here, I'm hesitant to name any without doing a little bit of research. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I think I'm in the same position. And I really think that speaks more broadly to a couple of things that I want to emphasize about homelessness prevention. One of them is that we just don't have a lot of good case study work being done on interventions that aren't just like house people. And housing is important, don't get me wrong, but there are nuances there, one. But two, homelessness prevention is an evolving practice. And the absence of, you hit it right on the head. Teddy's follow-up is exactly where I was going, which is it would be good to identify factors that contribute to success from a data perspective. Perfect. And here's what I have to say to you, Teddy, and all of the rest of you. Whatever data factors contribute to success will be local. There are commonalities between jurisdictions, right? So we can tell you the commonalities. We told you most of them today. Adopt a progressive engagement approach, invest heavily in housing problem solving rather than subsidies, coordinate with mainstream benefits to ensure that people are connected with what already exists, develop a housing plan and work that housing plan aggressively, try to identify what actually contributes to people experiencing literal homelessness, but for ESG assistance. But beyond that, the factors that contribute to success, and success here being defined as, first, identifying those but-for households and maintaining them in permanent housing, will always, always, always be local. And so what I would turn that back on you to say is, this is a good opportunity to get with your data folks and come up with an experimental design within your organization or within your COC to say, what are those factors? How do we identify them? What can we put in place to assess what works and what doesn't? And I think you will quickly discover what doesn't work, because in most communities with homelessness prevention, you're either doing a thing that mostly doesn't work, or more likely you're doing a thing that works all the time because you're not applying the but-for standard. But design your own assessment within your communities to find out what works for y'all. Because no matter how good of a case study, my intuition is, if I go digging in like West Virginia or parts of New England or like parts of the West Coast, like maybe King County, I'll probably find some good homelessness prevention data. But I can't tell you how relevant they're going to be to what you're doing in your COC in California. You're going to have to find that on your own. So I would encourage you to get with your data folks and design some experiments around that. Think about it. Mike, anything you want to add there?
I was going to add something actually, Gordon. Sorry, Mike. Part of the process that we're going through with the HP policy is also to have California HCD review homelessness prevention policies locally. I can imagine an event in the future where we review one that is stellar and head and shoulders above the others that we would use as a best practice in California. We are just starting that process though, so we don't have anything yet. But I could see that culminating in the release of something best practice related. That's a specific example from the state of California. Sorry, Mike.
No, you're good. I was just thinking, I love this line of thought and like the bringing in data and really analyzing it. And another example I can throw out there of how that's so important related to prevention is, we touched on this, but we didn't really dive into it in a deep way, but the idea of targeted prevention, right? To do targeted prevention, you really have to have some idea of causal factors for homelessness. And there are certainly some of those you can probably identify nationally, but there are others that are going to be very local. And an example of how that's recognized is when you look at the list of factors for the at-risk definition, the last thing on that list is other factors defined by the consolidated planning jurisdiction, which means a local jurisdiction, if they can do a solid analysis and identify causal factors for homelessness in their area, that can be a factor for the at-risk definition if it's included in their consolidated plan. But figuring that out requires detailed data analysis. It's basically academic level research, and I'm not aware of any areas where it's been done, or at least done well. So all that to say, I love this line of thought. I love the idea of thinking about the data sources and all the ways that data can be applied and analyzed to figure out the best way to do prevention. So just, I like this part of the conversation. The data is critical. That's all I've got.
Agreed. All right, other questions? We won't keep, we're not your second grade teacher. We're not going to start calling on people. But we do want to hold for a last call for questions. Anything about anything we touched on today? Okay, well, I think that's that. Kim, do you want to take us out?
Thank you, Mike and Gordon. Thank you all for attending the California Housing and Community Development Community Workshop session offered through the Emergency Solutions Grant, Coronavirus Relief Consulting and Staffing Services Contract. Look out for more information on the next new and non-traditional providers workshop series session. A 3-question survey will pop up as the session ends. Please provide your feedback so we can ensure these training sessions are useful as possible. Thank you all, and see you all at the next training.
Thanks, y'all. Have a good day.